Wait, there are different types of servers? There are different types of servers, and we'll take a look at. All right. First type is a domain controller. The second type is a member server. The third type is a standalone server, and one that doesn't really get too much notice because it's not really used as much anymore, but a quasi server. Yes, that used to be a thing. Domain controllers. They control user logons and authentication. So they have a list of the users, passwords, and so when you go to log on to your system, the system then reaches out to the domain controller. Domain controller says, hey, here's the user, and authenticates. This also stores information in Active Directory. So your Active Directory is a list of users, computers, security groups, the whole nine yards. So say John Smith has a user account in Active Directory. It may store things like his phone number, where he works, which branch he works at. So that's what gets stored in Active Directory. It also handles DNS and group policy. Group policy. Maybe you don't want users to make changes to their wallpaper in Active Directory. And it's the heart of the network. So basically everything happens on the domain controller. From users' logins to group policies. What is a member server? So this is kind of interesting. So the member server is a server that has been added to the domain. For example, we have another server that I created that I'll be showing you in a moment. It's called Nexus. Nexus is not a domain controller. It has not been promoted to it. However, it still is a part of the era-driven-tech.net domain. And by doing that, it allows it to use the domain controller for things such as granting people access and other things, as you can see in this image. So this one would provide services like file shares and applications. So you may think, well, what kind of applications are there out there that would have something? Usually when you start thinking about things like client to server type of applications such as QuickBooks. QuickBooks you install on a server, you let the manager run in the background while the clients access the databases that are usually stored on these type of servers. You may have them stored as file servers, so all company data gets stored onto file servers. In a later video, we'll be talking a little bit more why file servers are not as prevalent as they used to be. So it relies on the domain controllers we talked about a little bit before, where it still needs to authenticate just like any other workstation, right? So you go to log on to it to make sure everything's functioning and working like it's supposed to. Where does it go? It goes right to the domain controller and says, hey, this user. So there's a bunch of different things and reasons why that's important, but that's what that does. It also handles other things like printers. So if you have printers either old school connected via parallel port, connected directly to the server and the server uses it as a share, or if you have over Ethernet connected printers and then you share them out from that server. SQL databases, that's another one. So your SQL database may live on a member server. A lot of this stuff you don't want on a domain control. It usually is managed all again through Active Directories. But what is a standalone server? So a standalone server can run completely on its own without a domain controller or domain associated with it. For this one, it's usually good for like really small environments. Maybe you have an office with one or two systems. It's basically just to have a server set up with the server operating system. But in terms of like logins and everything, you no longer have centralized logins. So for example, you see on the graphic, kind of seen in the back on the monitor where it says local accounts. So every system, so if you had 5 workstations, each workstation would have a local account, meaning they're not tied into Active Directory, meaning the server does not handle that. So each system you would have to remember. So say you had a logon that you wanted on all the systems. For example, maybe admin needs to be an account that gets created on all the systems. You would have, unless you specifically changed it to be every system had the same password, each system would have their own password, each system would have their own internal group policy. So there's nothing that would control that. It would just be a server saying, hey, I've got resources, here you go. A common for budgets. And they were easier to set up. So the good news is you could literally turn on a server out of the box, set up a file share, and you'd be done with it. And that was it. And that was totally fine. However, it was harder to manage at scale. So now say that same 3 or 4 business turned into, I don't know, 100 user, 1,000 user, this company is super doing well. It's taking off and everything's going great. Now all of a sudden you have to make a choice. You either have hundreds, thousands of computers all over the place that all have individual creds and you have to remember and document all this stuff, or you start thinking about Active Directory. And again, this is why Active Directory is so crucial to businesses. Why? Because it's centralized. Not having thousands of computers. Could you imagine a company with over 50,000 users? And you're saying you have to go to every single workstation to update people's passwords, update policies, whatever it may be. That's ludicrous. That's insane. So back in the day, again, we talked a little bit about this at the beginning. What's a quasi server? What is this quasi server? This quasi server is ridiculously crazy, but it was a true, real thing. So this was often a workstation that acted like a server. That's right. You would have Windows, XP, some might have Windows Home on it because you'd go to the store, you'd buy a PC, you'd go home, set it up, or go to the office, you'd set it up. You'd be able to do things like installing QuickBooks Manager and all that type of thing. Or you'd have shared files, you'd have databases, you'd have applications on it. So why that would technically work? Because you would still be able to install things, again, like the manager on it. You'd be able to install all, other database managers on it. You'd be able to host files and applications, that kind of thing, which is, again, kind of the whole database management type thing. So why this worked was because it would allow that you to be able to use a regular computer, Windows 7 Pro Edition, Windows 7 Home Edition even, right? And you would be able to use anything. So now you're like, okay, well, so James, so what? So what's the difference between a quasi server and a standalone server? Because you're basically saying the same thing. You're basically saying, well, the home server, the quasi server, you'd have database management, file server. Okay, so you wouldn't have a centralized database like Active Directory. So what gives? Who cares? Well, there's a major difference. And the major difference is a quasi server uses a standard workstation operating system, meaning it would use Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows XP, anything Home Edition to Pro Edition, but it would use a regular operating system like you would have on any workstation. That's the biggest difference, where a standalone server would still have at least the server operating system on it. In terms of them being difficult to manage, it sounds like a cool idea. Maybe you have an office that really wants to get into having a centralized system. So it's kind of a centralized system because if one of the systems in the office goes down, you still have the server, the Quasi server set up and running. But it runs into the same problems as before. But there's also a bigger issue at hand: enterprise level components. So you have RAM that does error checking, ECC RAM. You have hardware designed to to be able to handle workflows and that type of thing. There's a big difference between having a Xeon processor, which is an enterprise level Intel chip, or like a Threadripper, which is like AMD's style enterprise chip, versus maybe an i7, an i5. Maybe you had an i3 running Windows 7 Home. So it stresses out the hardware even more because it might not be able to keep up with all the requests at a higher demand. So that's another reason why, at least with a standalone server versus a quasi server, you're dealing with enterprise level hardware versus hardware that's designed for the average user to do regular work on. And that could pose an issue, especially when you start to grow your company. So that was kind of an intro into the different types of servers out there, what are commonly used servers. And also going forward, you know, I'll make another video a little bit more where there's more integration with Microsoft, like Azure Sync, and different things that sync up your Active Directory. They call it a hybrid version. So we'll jump more into that. So that's basically it for the servers, the types of servers out there. And so we'll go from there and we'll talk more about those things again in later videos. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. And if you had any other, if you had any information about what we talked about, or thought otherwise, or remember Quasi servers from way back in the day, go ahead and leave a comment below, and we'll see you in the next one.